December 1943, the North Sea 30,000 feet. The cold at this altitude is a physical presence. It seeps through sheepskin, numbs the fingers, freezes the breath inside an oxygen mask for the men of the Luftwaffe. Scrambled from their bases in Holland and Germany, this frigid expanse is their hunting ground. Below them, a storm of silver crosses the sky, hundreds of American B-17s and B-24s, their contrails painting white scars across the pale winter blue. The German pilots roll into their attacks, Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts diving like falcons on unprotected prey. They have grown accustomed to this, to the kill, to the absence of American fighters this deep into Europe. But today, something is wrong. High above the bomber stream, much higher than the Germans expect, a new shape waits. It is sleek, almost beautiful. Its wings are thin, its lines clean. It does not bounce or weave, it simply waits. As the Focke-Wulfs commit to their dive, the new shape drops its nose. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license by Packard, screams. The P-51 Mustang falls out of the sun, and in that moment, the balance of power in the sky is over. Europe shifts forever. The hunters have become the hunted. To understand the terror the Mustang brought, one must first understand the terror it ended. By the autumn of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces were engaged in a battle of attrition. They were losing. The doctrine was simple, brutal, and flawed. The heavily armed Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, flying in tight formations, could defend itself against enemy fighters. It could punch its way to the target and back without escort. This was a myth, a costly, bloody myth. The 8th Air Force, based in England, was tasked with striking at the heart of German industrial power. The Schweinfurt, Regensburg missions of August and October 1943 became synonymous with catastrophe. On August 17, 376 bombers struck the ball, bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg. The price was 60 bombers lost. On October 14, the second Schweinfurt raid, what the Germans called Black Thursday, sent 291 bombers into the teeth of the Luftwaffe's defensive line. The Americans lost 77 bombers. Another 121 were damaged so badly they were never the same. The loss of airmen was staggering. Nearly 600 men killed or captured. A single day, the bombers could not reach the target, drop their ordnance, and fight off waves of Luftwaffe interceptors simultaneously. The math did not work. The Luftwaffe had engineered a defensive system perfectly tailored to exploit this American weakness. They called it the Reichsverteidigung, the defense of the Reich. It was a layered, calculated machine. Radar stations along the Dutch and French coasts tracked the incoming bomber streams as they assembled over England. Controllers on the ground, the Jägerleitoffizier, vectored fighter wings into position. The German fighters did not have to fly endless patrols. They waited on the ground, fueled and armed, until the Americans came to them. And when they came, the Germans hit them hard. They used tactics born of desperation and innovation. They flew their Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s in formation just out of range of the bombers' .50 caliber machine guns. Then they would turn into the stream head-on, the closing speed over 500 miles per hour. This head-on attack gave the German pilot a mere fraction of a second to aim at the pilot or the engines of a B-17, but it minimized their exposure to the bomber's defensive fire. They would slash through the formation, peel away, reform, and hit again. They dropped aerial bombs into the tight bomber boxes. They launched rockets from standoff distances, hoping to break up the formations. It was a feeding frenzy, and the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, the American fighters tasked with escort, simply did not have the legs to stop it. They could guard the bombers to the German border, but then with fuel gauges hovering near empty, they had to turn back. They would waggle their wings in a silent farewell to the bomber crews, leaving them to the wolves. The Germans knew this. They knew the exact moment the escorts departed. It was a schedule, a routine, and then came the Mustang. The P-51 Mustang was not born of a grand, visionary military specification. It was born of desperation and British ingenuity. In 1940, a British purchasing commission approached North American aviation with a request: build Curtiss P-40 fighters under Licensed North American's president, Dutch Kindelberger, made a counteroffer. He said his team could design and build a better fighter from scratch in 120 days. They did it in 117. The first Mustangs, designated Mustang Mk.I by the British, were powered by the Allison V1710 engine. At low altitude, it was fast, agile, and beautifully behaved, but at altitude above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine gasped for air. Its single-stage supercharger was insufficient for the thin atmosphere of the stratosphere. The British used the early Mustangs for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance, skimming the treetops of France. They were excellent at this, but they were not the weapon that would save the bombers. The transformation of the Mustang from a useful tactical fighter into a war-winning weapon came from a chance encounter and a British test pilot's intuition. Ronnie Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew the Mustang in 1942. He was immediately struck by its laminar flow wing, a radical design that reduced drag and increased speed. He realized the airframe was exceptional. It was only being held back by its engine. Harker suggested marrying the Mustang to the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, an engine with a stage 2-speed supercharger that gave it immense power at high altitude. The British tried it. The result was electric. The Merlin-powered Mustang, now designated the P-51B, came alive above 25,000 feet. It was suddenly 40 miles per hour faster than a Messerschmitt Bf 109 at altitude. It could outturn a Focke-Wulf 190, and crucially, when fitted with an external fuel tank, it could fly to Berlin and back. The Americans saw the potential. Packard Motors, under license from Rolls-Royce, began mass-producing the V1650 Merlin, North American retooled, by December 1943. The Merlin-powered Mustangs were arriving in England in significant numbers. The pilots of the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneers, were the first to take them into combat. They were initially skeptical. They had been flying P-47 Thunderbolts, massive, rugged but heavy. The Mustang felt fragile in comparison. The landing gear was narrow, the fuselage slender, but the moment they took it up, they understood. It was not just a fighter, it was a scalpel. It was light, responsive, and at full throttle it was a blur. The strategy for their use evolved rapidly. At first, the doctrine was defensive, stick with the bombers, but the Mustang's range meant it could do more than just defend. It could patrol the routes, sweep ahead, and hunt. The commanding generals, men like Jimmy Doolittle of the 8th Air Force, made a pivotal decision in early 1944. He authorized his fighter pilots to break away from the bombers and go looking for the Luftwaffe. The mission was no longer just to protect the bombers. It was to destroy the German air force in the air. The P-51, with its perfect blend of speed, agility, and endurance, was the weapon designed for this singular task. The stage was set for the aces to emerge, men who would turn the skies over Germany into a graveyard for the Luftwaffe. In the cockpit of a P-51D, the world is reduced to a few essential elements. The pilot sits under a clear bubble canopy, a vast improvement over the earlier birdcage versions. With their limited rear view, there is no armor plate at his back that isn't necessary. The entire aircraft is built for lightness. Before him is the gun sight, the K-14 computing sight. A piece of mechanical genius. The pilot places a pip on the enemy aircraft, feeds in the target's wingspan, and the sight automatically calculates the deflection needed for a hit. It takes the guesswork out of the kill. For a man like Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group, the Mustang is an extension of his nervous system. He is not a large man. Fighter pilots rarely are. They are wiry with sharp eyes and fast reflexes. Preddy flies his P-51, named Cripes A Mighty, with an aggressive grace. He understands that in a turning fight, the Mustang can best almost anything the Luftwaffe throws at him. The FW-190 is faster in a roll, but the Mustang turns tighter. The Bf-109 is dangerous in a vertical dive, but the Mustang can follow. Preddy's greatest weapon is not the 4.50 caliber machine guns in each wing, nor the sight. It is the view. The bubble canopy allows him to scan the vast, empty sky. He looks for dots, for glints, for the telltale contrails that give away the enemy. In this environment, the pilot who sees first lives, and Preddy sees first more often than most. He flies not with reckless abandon, but with a cold mathematical precision. He conserves fuel, manages his energy, and strikes when the geometry is perfect. To be an ace in a Mustang is to be a master of angles and altitude. The first encounters with the P-51 were met with disbelief by the Luftwaffe. German pilots, men who had been dominating the skies for years, were accustomed to a predictable rhythm. They knew the range of the P-47s. They knew when they could safely assemble for an attack. Then, suddenly, American fighters were everywhere over Hamburg, over Berlin, over their own airfields as they tried to land. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, is famously quoted as saying, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up," whether he said it exactly or not. The sentiment was accurate. The Luftwaffe's pilots, many of them veterans, with hundreds of kills, were now facing an adversary that was not only equal to their aircraft but superior. The Bf-109G, the workhorse of the defense, had been upgraded and modified so many times that its handling had become heavy and treacherous. Its narrow landing gear made takeoffs and landings a hazard. The FW-190, a brilliant design, lost its edge at altitudes above 25,000 feet where the Mustang thrived. The German pilots called the P-51 the little friend with bitter irony. They began to develop a new kind of fear. It was no longer just the terror of flying through the flak and the bomber's guns. It was the terror of being hunted on the way to the target and on the way home. Experienced aces like Heinz Baer and Gunther Rahl noted the change. The Americans were no longer defensive. They were aggressive, seeking combat. A new generation of German pilots, rushed through training with barely 50 hours in the cockpit, were being thrown against men like Preddy in superior machines. It was not a fair fight, and the casualty lists reflected it. The decision by General Doolittle to unleash the fighters marked a fundamental shift. Aerial warfare, the tactic became known as the fighter sweep. Groups of P-51s flying far ahead of the bomber stream would roam deep into German airspace with a single objective: find and destroy the Luftwaffe before they could even form up to attack the bombers. This was not defensive flying, it was calculated murder. The Mustangs would fly at staggered altitudes, some high as top cover, others low, to catch German aircraft taking off for landing. They would target airfields, strafing grounded planes and flak towers. They would lie in wait near known German navigation points, bouncing climbing fighters. As they struggled to gain altitude, this tactic robbed the Luftwaffe of its greatest advantage: time. German controllers now had to vector their fighters not just to the bombers but also through a screen of American fighters that were actively seeking a fight. The Jagdverband, the fighter wings, began to take losses before they even saw B-17. Pilots like Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group embraced this with savage enthusiasm. He would lead his Mustangs on missions so deep that some questioned whether they had the fuel to return. He understood that killing the enemy on his own airfield was worth the risk. The fighter sweep turned the skies over Germany into a free fire zone. For the American pilots, it was the ultimate expression of air superiority. For the Germans, it was a slow, grinding, inescapable blade. They could not train new pilots fast enough to replace the losses. They could not build aircraft fast enough, and they could not fly without being bounced by a Mustang. The Mustang's dominance was not just about tactics or pilot skill, it was built into its very structure. The laminar flow wing was a revolutionary concept, unlike conventional wings, which had their maximum thickness further forward. The laminar flow wing had its thickest point further back. This allowed air to flow smoothly over a greater percentage of the wing surface, drastically reducing drag. Less drag meant more speed, and more speed meant more energy to use in a fight. Combined with the Packard Merlin, the P-51D could reach 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The Bf-109G, at the same altitude, struggled to reach 386 mph. The FW-190A8 was slightly better but still fell short of the Mustang's top speed. The Mustang could climb with them, turn inside them, and dive with them. It carried 6.50 caliber machine guns, a devastating punch that could shred an enemy aircraft with a short burst. The ammunition load was generous, allowing pilots to engage multiple targets. Furthermore, the Mustang was a remarkably stable gun platform, the K-14 computing sight, which used a gyroscope to calculate the lead required for a moving target, gave American pilots a technological edge the Germans could not match. A German pilot had to rely on experience and instinct, Kentern or deflection shooting, a skill that took years to master. An American pilot with a few months of training could place a deadly, accurate burst on a turning target thanks to the sight. The Mustang was not just a fighter, it was a system, an integrated weapon where aerodynamics, engine, and aiming technology combined to create an almost unbeatable whole. It was the right machine at the right time in the right hands. The spring and summer of 1944 became the killing season, the climax of the P-51's dominance was not a single battle, but a relentless, months-long campaign of attrition that broke the back of the German fighter force. It culminated in the weeks surrounding the D-Day landings and the subsequent breakout into France when the Luftwaffe, already reeling, was forced to commit its remaining strength and have it shattered. The numbers tell a brutal story. In the first 3 months of 1944, during what the bomber crews called Big Week, the 8th Air Force lost about 2,000 airmen, but the Luftwaffe lost 350 of its best fighter pilots, men who had been flying since 1939, who had hundreds of victories, were being shot down by men who had been in combat for weeks. The German training program, already strained, could not cope. By June, the average German fighter pilot had less than half the flying hours of his American counterpart. They were being fed into a meat grinder. For the American aces, this period was a time of almost unbelievable opportunity. On August 6, 1944, Major George Preddy experienced the fighter pilot's dream. He became an ace in a day. Flying near the German border, his group encountered a large formation of Bf-109s attempting to intercept bombers. Preddy led his flight into the attack. The German formation, perhaps low on fuel or unaware of the Mustangs' presence, did not break immediately. Preddy closed to point-blank range. His first burst hit a Messerschmitt in the cockpit. It rolled and fell. He pulled up, scanned, and found another. The K-14 sight did its work. One after another, the German fighters fell. By the time the fight was over and his guns were empty, Preddy had personally downed 6 enemy aircraft. It was a feat that required not just skill, but a perfect convergence of aircraft performance, tactical surprise, and the enemy's weakness. He was now the top scoring ace of the 352nd Fighter Group, a living legend in his own time. But it was not only the high-scoring aces who defined this moment. It was the anonymous pilots of the 357th Fighter Group, the Yoxford Boys, who bounced the Luftwaffe's expert on their way to the Normandy beaches. It was the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group flying their P-47s in tandem with Mustangs, who strafed German airfields until they looked like junkyards. One pilot, Lieutenant Urban L. Drew of the 361st Fighter Group, claimed to me 262 jet fighters on a single mission, catching the revolutionary German jets as they slowed to land, their vulnerability exposed by the ever-present Mustangs. Perhaps no single mission better encapsulates the Mustang's absolute dominance than a story involving Lieutenant Wallace Emmer of the 434th Fighter Squadron. While the great aces like Preddy collected their scores, men like Emmer did the daily, dirty work of air superiority. On a mission deep into Germany, Emmer's flight was jumped by a large number of German fighters. In the swirling dogfight that followed, Emmer found himself alone. His wingman shot down, his aircraft hit. He was separated from his group, deep in hostile territory with fuel running low. Most pilots in that situation would try to flee, to hide, to survive. Emmer did not. He climbed. From his high perch he spotted a formation of German fighters below, lining up to attack a crippled bomber. Emmer, alone in his Mustang, dove into the middle of them. He fired, broke, climbed, and dove. Again, he was outnumbered, but his aircraft was better, and he used it. He scattered the German formation, saving the bomber crew, and then, with his fuel gauges flashing empty, turned for home. He made it back to England on fumes. That was the Mustangs' Legacy, it gave a single pilot the confidence to fight an entire swarm and win. By the late summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a coordinated fighting force. Over its own homeland, it was a guerrilla army launching hit-and-run attacks, conserving fuel and pilots for the occasional massive strike, the Battle of the Philippines. Sea in the Pacific might have been called the Marianas Turkey Shoot, but the skies over Germany in mid-1944 were their own turkey shoot. The P-51 pilots were shooting down German aircraft at a ratio of nearly 4-1. The climax was not one battle, but a state of being. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest the air. When the Allied armies landed in Normandy, they did so under an umbrella of near-total air superiority. An umbrella held aloft by the P-51 Mustang. The German soldier on the ground, whether a tank or in a trench, looked up and saw only Allied aircraft. His own air force was gone, swept from the sky by the little friend. The aftermath of the Mustang's dominance was written in rubble, oil fields, and body counts. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe had been broken as an effective fighting force. In the first 6 months of the year, they had lost over 2,000 fighter pilots killed or missing. The total aircraft losses for 1944 exceeded 10,000, the vast majority of them too. Allied fighters, the Mustang specifically, was credited with the destruction of over 4,950 enemy aircraft in the air during the war, more than any other U.S. fighter in the European theater. This number, however, does not include the hundreds, if not thousands, destroyed on the ground in strafing attacks. The strategic impact was immediate. The American bombing campaign, once a bloody gamble, became a systematic demolition of German industry. The P-51s cleared the skies, allowing the bombers to strike with precision. The oil campaign, the attacks on synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Merseburg, and elsewhere, choked the German war machine. Panzer divisions could not move without fuel. Luftwaffe training units could not fly without fuel. The German economy, already strained, ground to a halt. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later wrote that the loss of air superiority and the subsequent bombing of fuel supplies was the decisive blow to the German war effort. He understood that without fuel, all the wonder weapons, the Me-262 jets, the Tiger tanks, were merely expensive statues. The Mustang pilots, the aces and the unknown wingmen, became the aristocrats of the air war. Men like George Preddy became household names, their scores followed by an eager public back home. Preddy ended the war with 26.83 victories, the fraction representing shared kills, making him the top P-51 ace of the war. Clarence Bud Anderson, a double ace with 16.25 kills, survived the war to become a test pilot and a living legend. These men were celebrated for their skill, but they also carried the weight of what they had done. They had killed young men, often barely out of their teens, who were flying for a lost cause. The cold arithmetic of war required it, but it was not without its cost. For the bomber crews they protected, the Mustang pilots were angels in silver skins. A B-17 pilot from the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, later said, "When we saw the Mustangs, we knew we were going home. We didn't know if we'd be shot up, but we knew we weren't going to die in the air that day. That was the gift the Mustang gave, the promise of survival." But the aftermath was not without its own tragedies. The very dominance of the Mustang created new dangers. As the Luftwaffe faded, the P-51s were pushed lower and lower, tasked with strafing any target of opportunity, trains, trucks, airfields. This ground attack role was far more dangerous than air-to-air combat. Low and slow, the Mustangs were vulnerable to light flak, the ubiquitous 20 and 37 anti-aircraft guns that every German unit possessed. George Preddy, the man who had dominated the skies, fell to this very danger. On Christmas Day 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Preddy was leading his flight in a ground support mission. They spotted a column of German vehicles and dove to attack. As Preddy pulled up from his strafing run, his Mustang was hit by American anti-aircraft fire. The gunners, jumpy and expecting German aircraft, mistook his P-51 for an enemy. His aircraft rolled and crashed into a hillside near Liege, Belgium. He was 25 years old. The irony was brutal. The greatest Mustang ace, a man who had survived countless duels, With the Luftwaffe's best was killed by his own side, it was a stark reminder that in war, the line between friend and foe is sometimes terrifyingly thin. Wallace Emmer, the pilot who had fought off an entire formation alone, also met tragic end. He was shot down by ground fire in April 1945, just weeks before the war. Europe ended, he was captured and spent the last days of the conflict as a prisoner of war. He survived, but the war had taken its pound of flesh for every Preddy who became a symbol. There were dozens of Emmers who simply vanished into the fog of war, their heroism known only to their squadrons. The final tally of the air war was staggering. The USAAF lost nearly 8,000 bombers and 5,000 fighters in the European theater. German losses were far higher, but the human cost was immeasurable. The Mustang, the machine that dominated, was not just a weapon, it was a tomb for some and a savior for others. By V-Day, May 8, 1945, the skies over Europe were silent. The Mustangs had done their job. They had swept the Luftwaffe from the sky, and in doing so, they had hastened the end of the Nazi regime. The P-51 Mustang remains an icon, not merely because it was a beautiful machine, but because it represented a fusion of technology, strategy, and human will that proved decisive. It was the right weapon at the right moment, a key that unlocked the door to the German heartland. Its dominance over the Luftwaffe was not just a victory of horsepower or firepower, it was a victory of industrial might and tactical adaptability. The American aces who flew it were the sharp point of a spear forged in Detroit and tested in the skies over England. To look at a Mustang today, resting silently in a museum, is to see only the ghost. The real Mustang lives in the memory of those who flew against it and those who flew it. It lives in the cold statistics of the Luftwaffe's demise, in the empty airfields of Germany, and in the safe return of 1,000 bomber crews who owed their lives to its sleek silhouette. It was the hunter that became the savior, the machine that ended the reign of the expert. In the long, dark winter of World War II, the P-51 Mustang was the first light of dawn.